It's Thursday, December 7th, 2017, and this is a special edition of Views of the News. Normally, following this video open, you'd see me, Mike McKean, and Ernest Perry in our regular weekly roundtable on media behaviors, but not today. Today, we've got something a little different. I've spent this semester working with 5 students from the University of Missouri's Honors College. They're students who are interested in current events, politics, tech, and good storytelling. Some are journalism students, some aren't. But what I can tell you, they're smart, they're passionate, and they have a lot to say. Enough from me, better you hear from them. Here they are.
Thanks, Amy. The fight for net neutrality has resurfaced, following Chairman Ajit Pai's announcement that an FCC vote to repeal the Obama-era rules will take place next Thursday. This comes after the FCC changed rules on local media ownership. FCC commissioners voted 2-3 to allow for ownership of a newspaper and broadcast station in the same market, ownership of 2 of the top 4 TV stations in the same market, and eliminated the requirement that broadcast stations have to have a main studio in their coverage area, among other things. The decision has been widely criticized as opening the, quote, floodgates to more consolidation, as put by FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. So, put the rule changes in context with these pending Sinclair Tribune merger. What does this mean for local news media?
I mean, I definitely think we can all agree that it's probably not a good thing for local small businesses, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
It might be good in that they can get bought out, but I definitely think that it wouldn't be good for the coverage and the content of the papers.
And I read an article that said if the Sinclair Tribune merger is approved, they'd have control over 70%. They'd reach over 70% of the country, which is obviously problematic for like information dissemination if 70% of the country is getting their same information from the same news source.
Yeah, I mean, what I think of is the protests and how, you know, the big news companies came in here and tried to report on that story and how poor of a job they did. So I think local news is still really important, and I think we should be able to help them any way we can, and net neutrality really does help them.
So, speaking more on net neutrality, we talked about how like the FCC rules changes affect local media. How could net neutrality affect everyone beyond just the consumer costs? How could it affect the delivery of local media?
I mean, I think it definitely, in terms of a startup cost for a new tech startup or new communications outlet, it would be definitely harder if the barrier to entry were more expensive. So I think it might maybe make people disinterested in starting a new corporation instead of just going, and they'll probably just want to go work for another big, more established one that has more funds to handle the rule changes.
I think it's especially problematic for journalism outlets in general, especially with this current presidential administration that's very hostile towards news outlets. If President Trump could influence the FCC to slow down the New York Times or something like that, I'm not exactly sure how the logistics of it could work, but I do know it's problematic for free speech in general.
So, looking at the big picture then, you mentioned the this administration's approach to local media. So what do these actions say about the FCC's attitude towards like local media and media consolidation?
Obviously, they're much more pro-business than pro-media because this is heavily, heavily in favor of the business side of media, and it could drastically like affect the news dissemination and information that the news outlets are putting out, but obviously that's not a priority for this administration, and they're not really looking at the type of impact that local journalism can have, obviously, because these type of rules can really sort of squash the impact of news organizations that are already struggling for resources and finances and just really hindering their ability to put out quality content.
Yeah, and kind of what Cassie was going off of earlier, talking about how national news outlets would kind of just saturate the news market. And so when you open up your local newspaper, it's just going to be all AP Newswire stories and not written by local journalists. And so local residents are going to lose trust in those papers.
And there's already so much criticism of journalism for focusing solely on the coast, like East Coast, West Coast, and forgetting like the middle of America, and this would only worsen that problem.
I completely agree. Awesome. So last month, DANICA ROEM made history becoming the first openly transgender woman elected to the state legislature. The New York Times subsequently published an op-ed that said DANICA ROEM is really, really boring, emphasizing how her politics focus less on her identity and more on the issues she campaigned on, like the terrible congestion on Route 28. The topics she discusses in certain interviews are universal. They're experienced by all of her constituents. However, media and politicians still continue to refer to her identity over her politics. ROEM has actually taken to Twitter to call out certain outlets and individuals, responding to Channel 4 News' headline, Transgender State Legislature's Thanksgiving Message. ROEM retorted, "Hey Channel 4, y'all know I have a name, right?" ROEM has made it clear that although her identity is important to her and some of her policies, she has other things she was elected to work for, like education and infrastructure. So before she entered politics, Danica was actually a news reporter for 15 years, political reporter. How do you think her experience in journalism has affected her ability to call out these certain news outlets?
Obviously, she has the experience in the field, and she knows what type of headlines and what is newsworthy to certain news outlets, and so she's coming from a personal place, not only because of her transgender identity, but also because of her background as a journalist, and so she's not calling them out from an unqualified or uninformed stance whatsoever. And I do think it's important for us as news outlets and future journalists to not sensationalize headlines like this, and not to take advantage of her transgender identity to have like sensationalized headlines and things like that. But at the same time, it's obviously newsworthy and historic, and so it's just struggling to find that balance between highlighting her identity, like you mentioned, but also not exploiting her in that way.
And
Exactly.
as a political reporter, she knows that it should be focused more so on the policies and not her identity.
Exactly. So then where do you think the conversation moves then when things do, she does start to talk about policy, maybe that she has personal experience, whether it's her identity or her peers. How do you think that that'll influence, her identity will influence those policies that she's trying to push through, if she does choose to do that?
I think it really depends on how she kind of promotes herself and what her campaign is like. We saw that her campaign was just really focused on local policy. And so if she was touting, you know, like, I'm the first transgender elective here, like, and this is why, I think it would make sense for the news to focus on that, but she really wasn't focusing on that. So I think it's important to respect her campaign and kind of talk about how she's going to influence policy.
The majority of the focus on her identity was actually from her opponent that
Exactly.
used really hateful rhetoric during his campaign. So he was the one really focusing on her identity. It wasn't even her in the first place.
Exactly. So where do you think our responsibility as journalists and members of the media lies in discussing people that might have historical significant identities when we're talking about them in headlines or just stories in general?
Well, I think the tweet alone from the Channel 4 news station shows, and her response to it shows how she wants to be covered. Obviously, she doesn't want to just be focused on because of her identity. And so I think journalists need to learn what makes them comfortable and how they're able to open up about their policies and stuff.
At the same time, hopefully in the future we will be able to get to the point as a society where a transgender candidate being elected to the legislature is not newsworthy or the first in however many years. But for this one, it was history making. So it is also our job as journalists to make that known and to inform people of the context of the situation. And at the same time, that can, if we do it in the right way and use respectful language, it can be beneficial, because then it increases trans representation in the media.
I completely agree.
So a student at the University of Missouri is talking about the queer community in the news media as well, except she herself is the person being discussed, and it's at the local level, in the local city magazine, Vox. Her piece is about white privilege and its intersections with the church and being a member of the LGBTQ community. Her personal essay is one of 11 that stem from a project in relation to the aftermath of the fall 2015 protests here at the University of Missouri. A week in national headlines at the time has led to lots of changes in university administration and a good deal of follow-up coverage among multiple news outlets. In the 2 years since, lots of talk about that fall has led to a sense of fatigue among students, faculty, and residents of the Columbia community. But a group of Missouri School of Journalism students are exploring the theme of the protests, race and race relations, through a new lens, that of white privilege. The 11 students wrote personal essays about specific moments in their lives in which they recognized, or at least began to notice, their white privilege. They also tie that into stories of people and events from the protests and from other areas of the Columbia community.
I've had a very religious upbringing, and that's kind of what drew me to the idea of the church in the first place. I felt a little bit cast off from the church when I was younger, and so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about that experience for LGBT people in general. It's tough because I've not like I've been the beneficiary of privilege. Like I can't talk to people and say, oh, well, I experienced this because of my race. Like I can talk about good things I've experienced, but a lot of times I can't reference an experience that like a Black person has had, and that's not like my story to tell, but I suppose it's just a lot of times I just try to be an advocate for those people.
So the writer featured in this video recognizes her privilege as being a white person, but she also recognizes her experiences of oppression because of her sexual orientation, especially when she is around others in the Christian community. So obviously objectivity and transparency are hot topics in the world of journalism. So what do you guys think of students opening up about their personal experiences in a news outlet?
I think, well, first, I think we obviously need to recognize that all of us are white and we come from a place of immense privilege ourselves. And it's super important for us to examine our own biases because every single person has them. And they're not even apparent like in our writing and in our reporting unless we do the sort of deep reflection that these students working at Vox did, so that obviously this is not coming from a place to make anyone feel guilty or like increase these racial tensions, but it's really important for us as white people to examine this and know where our biases are so that in future reporting we don't make mistakes or biased reporting and sort of increase the objectivity of our journalism.
I think you're exactly right. And going off of that as well, I think being a student and already having these really difficult conversations and delving into these stories that you might be uncomfortable with at first is going to be really transformational in your learning experience, which I think is super important in college. I mean, this is the time to make mistakes or say, or have those really awkward conversations before you enter that really more professional experience when you graduate. So I think this is definitely the right time to start having these conversations. So
I know I've definitely had conversations with friends, like as like young sophomore journalism students who like want to cover issues such as like race relations or LGBTQ issues, but they are afraid to because they're not LGBTQ themselves and they come from this place of like privilege and like they're an outsider. And I don't think like the solution is definitely not stepping away from these problems altogether. It's this sort of like internalized reflection that will allow like someone who is like white or someone who is straight to report on these issues. And it's not like learning that like you can't tell the full story yourself because you come from this place of privilege. Like consulting with experts, like using the resources available to you is immensely important.
So when you guys read the 11 stories, do you guys feel that you learned more about white privilege and what it means?
Yeah, I think it was well done. I watched the video and I like the way they presented their stories, and I think this is a good catalyst for other journalists in this community to kind of go on the same path of self-discovery and recognize those things themselves. But I do not think that stories like this should kind of drown out the voices that people of color have in journalism, and I don't think these should replace their stories. I think they should be lifting up, those voices. So I think it's important to have a balance between stories like this, but then also talking to a student who's a minority and just giving them the chance to tell their story, because, this can't replace that.
I know that in the video they mentioned, like, it's a group of white journalists writing about white privilege, and so it's also our job to sort of recognize when it's our job to step back and, like, realize it might not be the best idea for us to tell this story, and someone with more personal experience and more invested in it would obviously be like the better storyteller for it, and we can obviously advocate for them and like help them and do all the other things, but like we can't be the main storyteller in every story.
So if you guys were to go about this in a different way, how would you do so?
I think the way they went about it, like the personal reflection, and I think like personal essays have the ability to be so powerful, and I think like if they would have maybe featured writers of color to give their own perspective to sort of contrast it. I know there were a few written by people of color in the class, but maybe like some other personal essays to supplement that might have been a good idea.
And I know we were discussing before, and you mentioned that like this was definitely just scratching the surface. So I think maybe contextualizing this in some sort of series that built upon, like maybe this is a first installment, and seeing how things progress over the years. Also including different perspectives by people of color. I think inserting I mean, what do they think about, you said there was a couple people mentioned in there too, but I think maybe building on this as a series, and like this is definitely not a complete comprehensive report of what it means to have white privilege, but I think making it more of like a, this is where we started the conversation, where are we going next, would be really helpful.
I do think it is a great first step, though, because many people have complained that like race relations since the protests have not changed whatsoever, and so this is sort of like the first step to make like improving, like you improve within yourself and then you improve outwards, and recognizing how maybe your own actions could have contributed to the problem.
It's been almost 2 months since Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and devastated the island. While numbers have been fluctuating, by recent counts, 60% of the island is still without power. Puerto Rico experienced catastrophic damage from which it will take years to recover. Hundreds of thousands of people are predicted to move to the mainland United States in the coming months in order to seek safety, but we aren't talking about it. While the dominating topics in the news right now are important, updates on hurricane recovery on the island are rare. Not only has it been difficult to find updated coverage, but finding verifiable sources has been a challenge. With conditions constantly shifting and multiple companies working together to restore power, it's hard to gauge what progress is being made. For instance, PUERTO, Puerto Rico's electric power company, estimates that most power will be back by mid-December. Jose Sanchez, the leader of another power company, says it won't be back until late February. Activists there say that the government has been inaccurate in counting deaths. Few are stepping up to check these numbers. In this lack of response, protesters in Washington have been taking matters into their own hands.
Protesters have gathered in front of the U.S. Capitol demanding more federal support for Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. Now, Washington has been criticized for not allocating enough money to disaster relief in the unincorporated U.S. territory. On Friday, the White House sent Congress a $44 billion disaster aid request, but lawmakers from hurricane-hit regions say that some is just way too small.
The government won't respond, journalists aren't covering it. The isolation of the island paired with the difficult verification process involved in reporting seemingly makes Puerto Rico a low priority in the news cycle. So what's happening here? Is this, the natural process of the news cycle, or is Puerto Rico really an exception?
I think this is really how a lot of times the news cycle seems to be going from like one shiny object to the next, just kind of bouncing around. I think it's that, but it's also due to the logistics of the whole thing and kind of an exacerbation of that. So like we have even more lack of coverage there because it's so hard to get those stories. Combined with kind of just moving around so fast because there's just is a lot going on that's really contributing to this vacuum around surrounding the coverage in Puerto Rico.
I also definitely think there's a component here to thinking that Puerto Rico isn't part of the United States. I know like over half of Americans, I don't want to misquote anyone, but a significant amount of Americans didn't even realize that Puerto Rico was a territory. So I think even just like the otherness that they do experience as a country could, lead to even our own government that's supposed to be representing them not knowing that those are their constituents as well as the people in the other 50 states. I just think that's on their list of priorities, probably not something that's ranking too high. This administration definitely has different priorities than I've seen in the past, at least.
And kind of going off that, I remember when the hurricane in Houston happened, we were talking about how there was a major influx of journalists, and almost to the point where it was a bad thing because they were causing issues themselves. But in Puerto Rico, we see that there aren't that many journalists actually going there, and I think that needs to be fixed. So that way those stories are being told as well.
And how do major news stories that have come out, like Weinstein in Las Vegas, how do you think the timing of all of that has affected it, if at all?
Obviously, like, the news cycle moves at, like, a very quick pace with, like, the 24/7, like, news cycle and the constant, like, CNN breaking news. And all the journalists are guilty of giving into that and just moving, like Christian said, from one news story to the next. And I think it's on us to go back to stories that require more attention and delve deeper, like with Puerto Rico. Like, why do they still not have power? Like, what is going on here? And we need, it's not all on journalists. Like, obviously some responsibility falls to the government, but like we are the ones who tell their stories, and we can't forget that like there's this large portion of American citizens, like they are American citizens despite a majority of people not knowing they are, and it's our job to be their champion when no one else will be. And I do think that, in general, we fail to do that.
And if we were to go back, and cover Puerto Rico again, how do you think journalists could have done better, and how do you think we can improve in the future when there's huge natural disasters like this?
Kyle mentioned sort of the journalists parachuting in to cover Harvey and things like that, and I think that it really it would require resources that a lot of newsrooms don't have, but getting journalists on the ground and allowing them to stay for a long enough time to get contextualized reporting and really learn sort of the background information as to why there's so many problems. And obviously that's difficult to do, but it's also so necessary because if you jump in, tell a story for 2 days and then jump out, you're going to miss a lot of information and just miss sort of the big context that comes with a story like this.
In situations like these, I think news outlets should be searching for freelancers in the area who actually know what Puerto Rico was like before the hurricane, because they would be able to tell the stories much more effectively.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to if you can't tell the story best yourself, then find someone who will. Don't just forget about the story altogether. Okay. Now, going back to October, when the New York Times broke the story about sexual harassment allegations against Harvey Weinstein, ever since the news has been filled with other stories of sexual misconduct by high-profile men, including comedian Louis C.K., Senate candidate Roy Moore, and CBS's Charlie Rose. In fact, just today, Senator Al Franken announced his resignation from the Senate. The women who have come forward have rightly been praised as brave for coming forward to tell their stories. However, some have accused the media of being biased towards the accusers and abandoning their journalistic duty to tell both sides of the story by immediately marking those accused as guilty. So, do you think that we should weigh allegations against someone like Louis C.K., who's a comedian in Hollywood, differently than allegations against Roy Moore and even Donald Trump? Or does his status as a public figure subject him to the same kind of scrutiny that we should give all those accused?
I just think that the prevalence and, as we saw in the Time issue that came out, this is something that affects every single industry. So I don't know if it's necessarily a debate on who we should pay more attention to, but instead realizing that this is a systematic issue that affects literally every single industry across the country and the world, honestly. I definitely think that people in positions of power that are elected I don't think they're being seen as many consequences just due to their sheer amount of buildup that they have in their communities versus comedians who we can just choose to not watch their show or not listen to their music. But I think politicians have a different point in that they are actually affecting the way that our country runs.
Going off that, I think there should be more continuous coverage of politicians when it comes to sexual assault allegations. I think that they should be weighed the same, but I think that the more immediate coverage should be of the politicians, especially ones that are up for election within the next week or so.
And obviously we've seen that the type of coverage like this and the type of sort of investigative journalism by journalists can have real world consequences. Al Franken just resigned today, and Matt Lauer has been pushed out of the Today Show at NBC. So I think it's really important for us to realize that like you said, in every industry, no matter how powerful, that these people should be held accountable. But there's even been allegations against people in the news media industry as well, like Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, like I mentioned, and even high profile people at NPR. So what is the best way for journalists in these situations to confront these allegations within their own industry?
I think two things that really stand out to me are immediacy and transparency. And even I think the next morning they went on the Today Show without Matt Lauer and just immediately confronted the situation. Were very honest about it. It didn't really seem like much of it was even scripted. It just kind of seemed like that was their immediate reaction. And personally, I think that's the best way of going about it, and just not sugarcoating anything and really just getting to the point and the consequences that person will be receiving.
Yeah, and with the NPR story, a lot of their reporters went really hard into their own organization, criticizing how this systematic issue became prevalent, to where these men in power could take advantage of women like that. So I think really hitting it hard and not holding back because it's your own organization is important as well.
And I think other news organizations should be looking at what's going on at other ones as well, like Vox, when they released the issue about Glenn Thrush, the political reporter for the New York Times. New York Times released a PR statement, and that's about it. They haven't been transparent with the process at all. So I think it's important for other news outlets to continue their coverage and to continue investigating those.
Yeah, I just think that, there are going to be those few people who come forward who make false accusations, but any accusation that's made should be given the time and effort by journalists to really investigate it and, try to hopefully come out with something better in the end and get those people out of positions of power. And, I just think about people in other industries like Hannah, you were talking about, and just the single mom who's working 3 jobs but has a really creepy guy at her work who, she's scared to go to work every day because of him. And I really hope that this, constant coverage we've had trickles down to those smaller businesses and that it becomes a business practice that, sexual assault is not okay.
This is like another instance where we as journalists can really implement applying intersectionality to our reporting, because like you mentioned, a lot of the accusers are high-profile, wealthy women who have the financial security to come out and accuse their bosses, and that's not always the case, with domestic workers, food service workers, and it's also our job as journalists to tell their stories as well, because this issue is not defined to politics or media. It is prevalent in every single industry, and it is I keep coming back to this point, but it's just so true that it's our job to tell these stories, and it's our job to tell the stories that won't be told, such as the workers experiencing this in just not the best circumstances.
Thanks, Amy. Back to you.
Aren't they great? I hope you've enjoyed their discussion as much as I have. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for helping me to direct and to produce today's special edition of Views of the News, and of course to our students for their engaging discussion.